Hello, everyone. My name is Dedric Holmes. I'm CEO of Cypher Sports and Wellness. Very pleased today to share some great information and content around the subject of diversity, inclusion, and equity. I'm joined today by a thought leader within the industry, Ms. Tiffany Young from Tiffany Young Consulting. Tiffany will share more about herself in a few moments, but I thought I would start by sharing you my experience as a skier. I've been a passionate skier for the last 10 years. Unfortunately, in the middle of my life, I took about 15 years off. The reason being, when I first got introduced to the ski industry, it didn't go so well for me. Take you back to 1993. I was a junior at the University of Nevada, and a friend of mine invited me up to the Tahoe ski resort area to ski. Very excited about the opportunity. I went there, and with my girlfriend, and I had a bunch of friends, and get out of the car and saw a lot of African American skiers, and come to realize that the National Association of Black Skiers were there for the weekend hosting their National Black Ski Week. So I was very excited about that potential opportunity to see literally hundreds of additional African Americans on a ski resort. As the day unfolded, unfortunately, things didn't go so great. And it started really early on in the day when I went to the ski, get a ski lesson. And as I learned, from my ski instructor, I overheard him say, well, I wish I would have known this group were here today, because I would have probably not shown up, because they typically don't tip so well. And I decided to let that comment go. Further on into my day, I heard multiple other instructors say similar things. Also heard another patron say, well, I wish the resort would have let me know that this was going on, would have picked a different weekend to come. So although those comments are definitely not potentially racist, they're definitely unwelcoming. And so for me, I spent those 15 years after that not going to any ski mountain or resort in the country, because I felt like me as a person, as an African American, would not be respected. And so fast forward 25 years later, I'm here today in front of you with Tiffany Young to have the opportunity to share about that experience, but more so create the opportunity for other people of diverse backgrounds to not have a similar experience once they start their experience into the ski industry. So with that, Tiffany, please share a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Dedric, for having me, and thank you for the opportunity to come before you all and really dig deep into some conversation around what happens at ski resorts around diversity, equity, and inclusion. As Dedric mentioned, I am the owner of Tiffany Young Consulting, and I lead the work around diversity, equity, and inclusion across the country. I'm fortunate to work with everything from law enforcement to communities that work around nonprofit, the Chamber of Commerce. I've worked with the McGraw-Hill Book Company and several other agencies. I am passionate about the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and my goal is always to build capacity. This work is not ever presented in a punitive manner, but sometimes it presses up against some of our core values and beliefs. And so my goal is always to provide information, resources, and build capacity. So I'm looking forward to our session today.
Thank you, Tiffany. Let's jump into what we'll be speaking about today within this opportunity to explore this concept, as well as for all of us to leave a little better, a little more information. So we have an agenda for you today, and so this agenda is really built on this idea of building capacity within each individual. Within resorts, within these corporations, there are individuals who are the forward-facing people, and we as the individual are the ones who really take the content and take this program forward. So despite all the policies and all of the guidelines that perhaps need to shift as we look into diversity and equity, most importantly, we ourselves have to shift as individuals. So we want to talk about what are some of the constructs related to building a better diverse background and environment. We also want to talk about bias, and white privilege. So those are two words there that typically has been thrown around a lot throughout 2020. But the question is, how does that land with you? And are you open to having a frank discussion about what bias is and what white privilege is? And thirdly, we want to create this environment for people to step into your ski resorts as their complete and whole selves. And so there are many opportunities for us to shift as an industry to make sure when anyone comes to our front doors within the ski industry, they feel welcome, they feel respected, and they want to come back and return again. Tiffany, any additional thoughts to add there?
Yes. So as we complete this session, our hope is that you walk away with deeper self-reflection, one about who you are, and then two about your business and the people that we serve. And two, we really want to make sure that as you look at this work, we hope that you are starting to have some intentional conversations. Again, as Dedric mentioned, and I've said before, it's capacity building. So our hope and our goal is for you to reflect, for you to shift, and that we have some true changes in our programs, practices, and even our policies.
Thank you. And beyond the opportunity to do the right thing, because it's always the right time to do the right thing, there are also some pretty substantial business implications related to the ski industry and our need to change and change now. The demographics in America, as we all know, are shifting. And so beyond just, pulling on your heartstrings to do the right thing from a diversity, inclusion, and equity standpoint, as an industry related to our abilities to shift and do the right thing to survive and to grow and to enhance our business, we think diversity, inclusion, and equity is at the forefront of our abilities to not only sustain ourselves as an industry, but to continue to grow and to expand. So let's look into some of the data.
Yes, and as we have this conversation and Dedric will move forward with this slide, we really want to make sure that we understand what is important to our businesses and within the industry.
So as this slide will tell you, 88% of all skiers or snowboarders are white. By the end of 2022, less than half of Americans under the age of 18 will be white. This stat over the last 2 decades has been closer to 76%. What that tells us, we're starting to shift. And so there's more diversity happening within America and will continue to do so over the next few years. America is experiencing a true meaning of a mixed salad. Simply said, if the ski industry does not adjust and become more welcoming throughout its marketing on mountain experience, there will be a price to pay, not only today, but in future generations to come. And so what we have to do is start to make those shifts and those modifications now where people feel more comfortable, not only coming to the ski resort, but then feeling comfortable and feeling valued as a customer to want to continue to come back time and time again.
So we really want to think about what that shift looks like. When I'm having conversations with whether it be the Chamber of Commerce or the mining companies, is to really consider what would be the impact of having a more diverse service, a diverse workforce, a diverse company of people that are around us. And you have to understand what the implications for your business will mean. And considering that conversation about that mixed salad, that means that we have the opportunity to still bring our authentic selves into a place, but combined, we bring about great resources and great outcomes, just like the great flavor of a mixed salad would be.
Thank you so much. So whenever we want to talk about how do we create change and create culture, I always like to start with the construct. And so let's start with this construct as for something for us as an industry to embrace and to develop and to grow in. So the idea people are coming to our resorts all across North America because they love something about being outdoors, being in the mountains, the fresh air, all those great values that we see within the opportunity to be in a resort and be in the mountains are things that are the context of the mountain resort and why people are coming. So that's our base and that's our foundation. Secondly, we have what we call our external assets. So you think about all the things that we love about the ski industry and the mountains and the fresh air, it still needs an external asset or a delivery system. And that's those folks who are in the ski schools, food and beverage, mountain hosts, guest services, all the people who are forward-facing with our patrons are the people who have to be the external assets and create that additional, I get this, I feel valued, I want to be here and spend more time and resources. Then you move over to the internal assets. You think about our context again. And so the idea of an internal asset is someone walking away from your resort feeling a sense of pride, or they completed a mission or a goal. So perhaps they simply downloaded off a ski lift for the first time successfully without falling. They went down their first, green hill, blue or black or double diamond. So the idea is that they create these external things that allows them to go back home and have this sense of pride and sense of accomplishment, or things that we love about our industry. Now, the idea here is we want more people to experience that, and to experience that, we have to have cultural competency. And so for us to have cultural competency, it goes to the very top of our pyramid, and it's our ability to see and speak to each and every. So regardless of race, gender, or age, do we have the abilities as each person who is interacting with these individuals to really make them feel welcome and want them to come back time and time again? And for us to do that, we believe firmly the ability to create cultural proficiency environments starts with us and starts with some training that hasn't been done to date within the ski industry.
And just to add to that conversation, Dedric, is that work of cultural competency is an inside-out approach. We individually have some responsibility to examine our own core values and beliefs. We want to internally look at who we are and what that looks like daily in our jobs and our practice. And as we start to do that, we can then ensure that we're working towards building a more culturally proficient and culturally welcoming environment.
So when you see these three skiers on your resort, what do you see? What do you really see? And so often, a lot of times, because of society or how we've been raised, we want to say something that we think is right. But the question here and the idea of this training today is really to understand and be honest about what do you see? And based off of what do you see, how do we then move forward to understand what we should be seeing and how we see these people as complete and whole? And it's our job to make sure we support them and give them the best experience possible within our resort. Here's another family here. And so the interesting thing here is, have you ever taken a second to look at a diverse family coming to your resort? What are some of the unique challenges that they may face? So I could, speaking of, someone from past experiences, being the past 10 years on at a ski lodge or at a ski resort. I have a young son who's now 16, but he started when he was 6. And so the idea of me taking my son in, northern Utah or Wyoming or Colorado to ski school, and he's young, only kid of diverse background, that was something I had to think about. Or perhaps even having the only instructor, and there are no instructors there, of diverse backgrounds. And so how does that make him feel? Does he feel more comfortable in that environment? And so the reality is today within our industry, because there's such a lack of diversity, a family like this has to take some serious considerations in terms of decisions they make, where they're going to spend their money, where they're going to spend their time out on a mountain resort. And so it's our job to make sure this family feels more welcome. There's more opportunities for them to see diversity and more opportunities for them to feel comfortable letting their kids go to ski school or be part of the mountain experience that they have. It's our job to make sure that we recognize the challenges that they have, how we start to meet some of those demands.
Even as we think about this phrase diversity and we start having conversation about diversity, we know that it goes above and beyond, but it also includes conversations about racial and ethnic diversity. Dedric mentioned in the opening that we want to talk about people of different races and backgrounds, people that speak various languages, people of different abilities, and even socioeconomic status. And so there's so much work to be done to understand what it looks like and feels like when you see people that look like you in a certain space. It solidifies the fact that you should be there. And so when we don't see that, there's oftentimes a feeling like we may not belong, nor are we welcome in those particular spaces.
So let's talk more about guidelines and not being the solution. So obviously we do understand that policy and guidelines need to shift. And we would think that the ski industry needs to take a serious look at their guidelines and their policies, their procedures, as well as their marketing to say, what have we done to date to be more welcoming to people of diverse backgrounds? And so we're going to get into that right now. But before we do, we need to talk more about what Tiffany said. This is really an inside-out job. So we start with this idea of privilege and culturally competent models. And so the idea being here, we want to have you remove yourself from this model, meaning if you have to always view this as I'm good or I'm bad, based off of where I may fall within my diversity understanding, then that becomes a challenge. It becomes a hindrance to you developing it and creating more capacity. So this idea of you being good or bad based off of where you are today in diversity, we need to remove that for a moment, remove your self-identity, and really understand what the situation, the realities may be. And then from there, if you move over to the right side of this slide, you can be more empathetic. You can start to understand and explore systems and constructs that have been systematically there over many, many years. And once you remove yourself, yes, you've worked hard, yes, you've done many things to achieve your level of success, but that doesn't mean that you haven't been privileged. It doesn't mean that you haven't been biased. And so the idea here is to step away from that for a moment, look at the constructs that are there, and then how do we as a group and as the industry start to develop, design, and improve on where we've been to date.
To Dedric's point, this conversation really implores us to take some self-reflection. It really pushes us to think about what pieces of privilege do we hold. All of us hold some form of privilege. And if we're not using that to diversify our networks and diversify what happens around us, we may potentially perpetuate the outcomes that we already have. And so taking the opportunity to take an inside look and draw out what we need to explore some of the systemic constructs that may be barriers for us to build a more diverse network.
Tiffany's going to share this model here, so I think this is a great conversation to really start to dig into some of that.
So the tool that you see on your screen right now is called the Cultural Proficiency Continuum. This tool is designed for you to examine a policy, a practice, a decision, even a conversation that you may have, but you're not to put yourself on this continuum. Imagine if you decided, I'm going to put myself in a culturally destructive space and then trying to get out of that space. That is not the purpose of this tool, but it is designed for you to reflect and think about this. At the far left, you have culturally destructive practices. That is really talking about we see things differently and we're going to stomp it out. We're going to completely get rid of it. So if you have a policy or people show up and they don't fit the parameters of what you consider to be right in your space, and you do things to eliminate their opportunity for connection, you can clearly see where that can become a culturally destructive behavior. The next is that when you talk about seeing the difference and making it wrong, we know that as we try to open up our world to more diversity and more culturally inclusive opportunities, we may say things that may not fit into the way we normally function or the way we normally do business. And so if we have behaviors or policies or decisions that respond that makes that wrong, instead of understanding the difference, that is where you'll see the incapacity portion across this continuum. The next point will be this area of blindness. And this is really talking about seeing the difference and act like you don't. So when we start talking about some of the discomfort that we may experience, or we start having conversations around race or gender or socioeconomic status, we may make statements like, well, we don't see a person according to their race, or we don't see a person according to their gender. And there's some challenge in that. Blindness is not real. What I tell people all the time is that if you can find a crayon in a box of crayons, you can see color. And so if you can recognize up front someone's gender, their language, their gift, or their talent, you see it. The blindness comes in when we have this desire to defend ourselves. We want to be seen as good, and we don't want to point out what's very clear and present. So this blindness part of the continuum becomes a tipping point. And so then you ask yourselves, what happens next? You can look at pre-competence, and you can start to talk about whether or not you're seeing differences, but you responded to it inappropriately. So let's take this training, for instance. You may say at the beginning, you may have had some culturally destructive policies or practices. You may have made some choices and comments or discussions about people based on even what Dedric opened with that were different, and so you made it wrong. You may have even said, well, we don't see color and we treat everyone the same. But pre-competence is saying we're going to make some decisions, we're going to make some efforts, and we're actually probably going to mess up a few times. And that's okay. Let's give ourselves some permission to make some mistakes so that we can grow and move forward. So we see the difference. We're responding to it, but it's still somewhat inappropriate. A perfect example of this is we're going to do a marketing campaign for the month of February, which is Black History Month, and we'll put people of color on the poster, but we don't do that any other time during the year. That's pre-competence. That's a piece of effort trying, but you're still maybe making some mistakes. The next point in this continuum would be the competence area. And so when we talk about this competence, this is seeing the difference. We're understanding the difference that difference makes. And this means that we're going to start to do things with people and not to them. So if we want to increase the diverse representation, we want to reach out to people that are different from the majority. That means we're going to go ahead and ask opinions. We're going to bring some people in. We're going to have the shared experience, but we're going to do things with people. And then the last of that continuum becomes the proficiency. We see the difference, we respond positively, we engage, and we adapt. And this is the toughest part. It may seem simple, but this is where the advocacy begins. This is when you're sitting around the table and you're planning and you're talking about who you serve, or you're talking about who is in your industry. And then you intentionally start to do the work and the advocacy is happening. So that's where the shift happens. And so we want to make sure that we have shifting and changing, and we can take this continuum and consider a discussion, any policy, a practice, a program, an event. We can run it across this continuum to examine whether or not we're leaning into building a true culturally proficient environment.
So a question there for you, Tiffany. I know we're not supposed to put ourselves on this continuum, but sometimes people do. And I guess the question could be, is it possible that someone actually straddles several different levels here? So they could be potentially destructive in some of their behaviors, but also maybe pre-competent in another area?
Yes, and depending on the level of experience that you have, your age, your kind of cultural global worldview, there can be bouncing back and forth. This continuum, as you see, doesn't have endpoints. So you could be on any place in this continuum in a conversation, a progress, a program. You may have had a conversation that was culturally destructive, but you created a policy that was incompetence. And so you can be anywhere on this continuum at any given point in your work and in your role through your journey of cultural competence.
And I would imagine from time to time, we as humans may potentially be proficient, for a few months, and maybe we slip back to pre-competence in a certain area, and then we go back and forth. So it feels like it's always evolving and moving as we do in life.
Mm-hmm. And that's why the core piece of the conversation of diversity, equity, inclusion, and cultural competency is to remember that it's a journey. And it's a journey that doesn't end. We are evolving and we're growing. And so if you feel as though you enter this session and all of your questions were not answered, or you did not get all of the information you needed, remember this is opportunity for seed planting work. And this work is a journey.
And I would say the fact that you're listening to the sounds of our voice today, if you're taking part in this video, you started that work. Now, again, it may be uncomfortable as you move forward, but the fact that you started, we want to applaud you for that. And the idea here is to continue to move and push each individual, and that eventually an individual affects policy. Policy affects guidelines, and guidelines expect how we as an organization, as an industry, will allow ourselves to be better in this particular continuum, and also doing a better job of making sure more people feel comfortable within our resorts and our spaces. So we always want to give you some opportunities, some ways to develop and to enhance and grow. And so we came up with 3 ways to support diversity, equity, and inclusion at mountain resorts. And I can tell you it starts with each individual person. Again, we can't say enough this idea that it starts from the inside out. So Tiffany will share some ideas and some thoughts for you to really expand your capacity to do this work.
So what you'll understand is this is different from like the traditional typical diversity training. Diversity training kind of talked about what was happening on the outside of you. This work needs to be internalized. So as we think about a couple of things and we want to acknowledge and address even our lack of cultural experience, we have to remember that being a person of color doesn't give you a bonus to have all the answers. And being a person who is white does not mean that you do not have the answers. But the core responsibility is the skill, the will, and the ability that we need to grow. So the skill really means to work to deepen your understanding of systemic racism. And while you may say this does not apply here, we have to understand that there are oftentimes systems in place that because of the own places of privilege that we hold, we may not see. It doesn't mean because we don't see it that it doesn't exist. So we have to do the work to gain the skill necessary to give us the awareness that these things are in place. And then we can work to prevent them from landing in our places of businesses or organizations. As you start to build the skill, it will deepen the will you have for change. So this will really to work to understand why you may have blind spots on topics related to systemic racism. We have to remember that each of us has some foundational piece to us. We either hold very tight to the way we were raised, or we run as far away from that as possible, and we take some sprinkles in between. So that will really means that I'm going to examine how I grew up. I'm going to examine places that I've been and traveled. I'm going to think about the rooms that I'm in, who's missing, who looks like me, who is different from me. That means I'm going to have to take some effort and some energy to get to the will of that work. And as you gain the skill, as you lean into your will to engage, then that ability shows up for you. And that ability comes in that advocacy, that last part of that continuum, where we want to develop, we want to execute, even redo or define our approaches to assisting with dismantling systemic racism. And this is not just a one-to-one conversation. We may have unconsciously or unintentionally created programs or policies that are barriers to people that don't look like the majority of who you serve. And so we have to do some things that make us uncomfortable. That means we have to press up against any privileges and even sense of entitlement that we hold. That means we also have to find people that are willing to do this work with us so that we can shift. And it's not done in a punitive manner, but it can be really uncomfortable. But in that discomfort is opportunity for growth. What I'd like people to know is that you may have an uncomfortable conversation. You may even be in an uncomfortable situation, but some people are uncomfortable their entire lives. If you allow yourself's ability to lean into that discomfort, that is where the growth will happen.
So some other strategies for us to continue to evolve and to develop and grow as an industry, and this idea of developing cultural mastery. So obviously within the ski industry, we have people who are very expert in skiing and snowmobiling and snowboarding. But the idea here is how do we take that same idea or concept of mastery and now apply it to our abilities to create diverse strategies that allow more cultural sensitivity within our spaces. We start with this idea of intention equals attention. So this idea is we have an intention as an industry to make sure all of our clients who come through our doors feel valued, feel respected, and want to have a great experience and come back again. If that's our intention, then our attention has to match that. And so beyond just our typical how we advertise and how we market to one segment, if our true intention to make sure everyone feels comfortable, how we shift our marketing has to start to match our intention. And so perhaps when you see the next marketing strategy coming out of a particular resort, consider having different faces on your marketing program that looks more like the diversity of America that we talked about earlier. If not, if you say you really want to be creating mastery around this idea of cultural proficiency, and you have the intention to do so, but if you don't do anything with your marketing, you don't do anything with your training of your staff, then I would really question, your abilities to get this done. So we start with our intention always matching our attention. Then we move on to this idea of capacity building. So beyond having the intention match our attention, we have to build strategies, concepts, resources, programs to ensure that each person within our industry, within our resort, has the ability to build a little bit each day, each year, to where they're getting better and better in terms of their ability to create an environment that's really welcoming for all. Tiffany.
And when we talk about capacity building, we have to remember that, we don't know what we don't know. And so until you bring people into a space that are different from you, that have different knowledge and skills and experiences, you won't be able to disrupt some of the ways we've always done business. So the capacity building is key. It does not do any good to point a finger or put you in a place that points you out and calls you negative. But when we build capacity, we're going to have to break apart some things. We're going to have to interrupt some narratives so then we can take the steps necessary to build you to the level that you need to be. But remember, the capacity building is not one and done. It is definitely a journey to help you grow.
So it would be fair to say, Tiffany, as part of capacity building, similar to the continuum, we're going to make mistakes from time to time. The key there is to identify the mistake, understand what happened, how do we improve on it moving forward.
Yes. And so we have to really think about our lived experiences play so much more into what we do every day than we can even think. Sometimes we don't realize that a thought that shows up, or a bias that shows up, or even a piece of privilege that shows up, all of that is internally in us and it comes from somewhere. So when we do this work, thinking about that continuum, give yourself room and permission to make a few mistakes, but don't shut down. Lean into that, examine where it came from and the why, and then we can move forward to build you to a place where you have the capacity to truly engage in the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
The next strategy here is to check in on our implicit bias. And so that's another buzzword that's been around this year, and some people have a challenge with it. I can tell you from my personal experience, even within the golf industry and being a executive for 25 years, yes, golf industry has been very racist over many years. But me as a male, I still enjoyed privileges and I had biases. And I can recite, a few years ago, I had the opportunity to hire an individual, and it was between two highly qualified people. One happened to be a diverse candidate, female who was gay, and the other one was a straight male who was white. And so as I started to examine, they both were very well qualified. My bias told me, well, because she's gay, because she's of diverse background, will she fit in here? And more so important, will her colleagues accept her? So I had the ability and the bias as a male to make that conversation with myself. Fortunately, I ended up hiring her and she did a great job. But the point being, I didn't recognize I had bias until I started to reflect on the thought that I was having related to making that hire and making the decision for her without even giving her the opportunity to step in to fend for herself. So with that, what we really have to do is lean from the front. And I'm sure there are many examples that you have within the ski industry, the ski idea here. Each and every one of us has to lead from the front in our behaviors and our actions and what we say, what we hear other people say, and hold them accountable for that. So the more we lean in and be accountable for our actions, the better off we're going to be as an industry.
And the thing we have to understand about this conversation of bias and privilege is some of you may be watching this thinking, I'm not sure that I want to continue to listen to this conversation. And that's okay. What we have to remember is that if you have a pulse, you have a bias. This is not a bonus that goes to any particular group. Every single person breathing has a bias. But you have to understand the key to this conversation is the word implicit. That means that we typically unconsciously don't know that it's there. It's not really brought to our attention until someone says something, they feel it, they recognize it. But the implicit is the key to the word, to that conversation around bias. We don't know that they exist. And so it often takes a critical friend or maybe someone not so friendly to bring about the awareness that the bias is there. And even acknowledging privilege without devaluing your self-worth, this doesn't mean that you're a bad person. We typically get into these conversations and our immediate response is, I'm a good person and I don't have biases, or I'm a good person and I don't have privileges. But when I lead professional learning and I'm training around cultural competency, I have to remind people that this goes back to, if you're breathing, it exists. And so if we can wrap our heads around that, then we can engage in this conversation of how we check our biases, how we acknowledge our privileges, how we understand that it doesn't make us a bad person. It's what you do with those that land in our practice every day.
So some additional steps to identify and address and relate to unconscious bias. And so Tiffany's going to walk us through these 7 opportunities here.
So we list these 7 steps for you to really think about, how do we do the work? You've probably listened to this video. You've probably felt a range of emotions. We hope that you're taking down a great deal of notes. And then you're saying, well, what do I do with this? So the first step is really to recognize that you have biases. Again, check your pulse. If you're all breathing, then you have a bias. We all have them. So this is not a finger pointing conversation, but we have to acknowledge and recognize that the biases exist. The next step after that is really identify what those biases are. That means we may have to look in our own backyards. You know, that old NIMBY concept, not in my backyard. Well, this is the opportunity where you need to step back and take a look. How are you raised? What do you read? Who do you spend time with? What information is fed into you? This will help you do some deeper work of identifying what those biases are. Then after you've identified them, we have to do some work to dissect those biases. Where did they come from? Were these things that you heard around the dinner table when you were younger? Are these the group of friends and the topics of conversation that are talked about? Do you feel a certain way about people that have a different experience or speak a different language? We have to dissect those biases. After you've done those three things, we're going to talk about how do you decide which of those biases you'll address first. Because this can be a very scary experience. As you do this work, you may find that you have more biases than you thought. So let's take it one step at a time. We're not going to be able to dismantle or interrupt all the biases in one day. So you may want to start with a couple that are manageable. The last three of those 7 steps are look for common interest groups. Now, let me be clear. This doesn't mean look for people that have the same biases as you. This is about looking for people that want to do the bias work. So find people that are saying, I really want to do some self-reflection. I want to have some courageous conversations. I want to dig deep and have some conversation about my privilege or entitlement. Look for those common interest groups. And then you want to get rid of those biases. Now, if it's a bias about cookies versus cake, you can hold on to that. But if you have biases that really impact the lives of people, you want to get rid of those biases. How do you frame and reframe your thoughts and your processes? And then the last is be mindful of your bias kickback. Because if you decide that you've done several of the steps and you hold these biases and you say, I don't care, I just want to keep them, be mindful of that kickback. If you're set in your ways, if you're resistant to change, if you don't see the need to shift in practice, that means you may want to settle in on the fact that things aren't going to be matching the outcome of what society is looking at. It's not going to match the changing demographics. It's not going to shift who we bring into our businesses and organizations. And this is intentional work. So as you look at those 7 steps, you can take them one at a time. Take a little bit of time to process and find out even where you think you can sit in being able to uncover and address any unconscious biases that you may hold.
So I think back on your comments here, Tiffany, and I look at one of the earlier slides with the African American family at the ski resort, and I'm wondering, would it be even a good idea from time to time, if you have clients with diverse backgrounds and if you build some rapport, and to ask them, what's your experience been like? How can we be better? So instead of assuming, is there value in having conversations with people who don't look like us, who perhaps come from a different part of the country, or definitely have different ethnic makeups?
There's always value in that, and you just need to be able to be prepared for what you're going to hear. So when you ask a question, be ready for the answer. I think we should always reach out to people that don't look like us or people that we want to be able to serve and ask their feedback. Ask questions like, have you ever been skiing before? That would be one great question. Ask questions like, when you did go skiing, who did you see? Did you see people that looked like you? How were you treated? What have you heard from your friends when you told them you went skiing? We know that there is some stereotypical and biased thoughts and beliefs about a range of groups, depending on skiing or swimming or flying. I mean, you could go on and on and on. And so while this is a brief discussion, this work requires intentional lean in, but it also requires commitment. You really want to ask yourselves, how long can you endure and how much are you willing to lean into this process for change?
I've been on ski tours before, a lot of times it's 7 or 8 men right up with a ski instructor who was with another group, and they saw me and they asked me some frank questions on how do we get more diverse people in our sport. And so the fact that I was not their client and they asked me that question made me feel valued. And so, you know what, this is a place I need to come back and frequent because they know that there's something that needs to change. And so when that interaction happens, there's a level of authenticity that I think that hits that individual that wants them to be there more and understand that this place is a place for me to feel safe, to grow, and to really have the experiences that I came to have.
Yes, definitely. Definitely.
And moving on, acknowledging and addressing your lack of cultural experience. So we talk about bias and we talk about these other things, but one thing is we have to sometimes look up and say, you know what, where am I lacking with my experiences and how can I improve on that? So we're going to spend some time working through that process.
So as we talk about acknowledging and addressing your lack of cultural experience, we really want to understand there's work, and then there's develop, right? So we talk about work. We want to work to deepen our understanding of conversations around systemic racism. When you have that conversation, it is couched in cultural competency, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want to work to deepen your understanding of systemic racism and even how there could be potential barriers to successful outcomes. Next, you want to work to understand why you may have blind spots on topics related to systemic racism. What we know about privilege is wrapped up in blinders. We see and we do what we live. And so if these aren't things that have ever come into your lived experience, or if they have not been things that have brought to your attention, or they have not been things that have impacted your life, you more than likely have not seen them. That does not make you a bad person. That just means you may have a blind spot in those particular areas. And so as you start to encourage this conversation, as you start to address the lack of cultural experience, you'll probably see a greater vision about the things that we've been blind to based on our lived experience. And then the last is really this develop. We want to develop, execute, as you said, redo, refine your approach to assisting with dismantling this racism. We really want to be able to understand that there are opportunities. This is opportunity for growth. This is opportunity to build your capacity. This is opportunity to really, truly embrace what it needs to be and what it looks like to have a diverse, equitable, and inclusionary process in our agencies. I would love to see our ski resorts look the way our world is looking all the way across the country.
So in terms of kickback here, Tiffany, when you look at this idea of develop, and someone says to you, well, listen, I'm 70 years old and I've seen a lot of change in my 70 years. When I was growing up, or in the 60s or 70s, you look at where we are in the 2000s, there's been a lot of progress and a lot of growth. And so, are you sure that there was this idea of systematic racism? Have we not moved past that? We've had a Black president for, 8 years over the last few. What does that mean in terms of where we are today, and can we still say that, systematic racism exists?
Well, we is a collective statement, and we, even when we think about conversations within like our Native American communities or indigenous peoples conversations, there's always we statements because that is the connectedness within that group. But when we say things like, haven't we moved past this? I would say to an individual is, if you believe we've moved past it, let's talk about what you've done to contribute to the we, right? So we really have to ask ourselves, what have I individually done? Or have I just subscribed to a thought or a way of being that we've moved past some things? We may have grown and shifted in some areas, but when we look at some particular things like skiing or swimming or, some of these areas, we see some sprinkles of change. But have we individually examined what our work and role is in the changing outcomes? Or are we just subscribing to this method and notion that we have shifted and we have grown and we have changed? We have to own our own individual accountability.
So obviously, with that being said, and some of the stats I showed with the ski industry, you could make a pretty bold statement of saying we as an industry, as the ski industry, has not shifted as fast as the rest of society, but the opportunity is there to start to do the work today, not only for it to be the right thing to do, but because from a economic standpoint and ability to proceed and grow, we have to do the work.
Yes, and this is a step in that right direction. So being engaged in this call, watching this recording, leaning into this process says that I am ready to take some individual responsibility and accountability to shift the changes around us.
So we want to leave you, our goal is to keep this right under an hour, and we're getting close to time. But there'll be other opportunities for us to interact and to work with you. We look forward to really expanding and growing this work. And the idea here is to get you an introduction to the vastness of diversity, inclusion, and equity. But the work is really just beginning. And as Tiffany said, it starts from the inside out. And so we want to leave you with the opportunity to start to develop more opportunities to really grow yourself individually from the inside out through the Harvard Implicit Association test. Tiffany, please share more about this.
Yes, so the test is online. It is free of charge. And what I would encourage you to do is take a look. The Harvard Implicit Association test will give you a snapshot of maybe some of the biases that you weren't aware of. What you have to understand, it's not an exact science. It doesn't tell all of who you are, but it definitely gives a window approach to see. You can take this test around race, gender, sexual orientation, criminality, levels of ability. It gives you a range. And what it does is allow you to respond by keystroke based on the images that you'll see on the screen. Now, for some of you, it may show you and affirm the biases that you thought you already had. While others, it may uncover some things that you were not aware of. But as you take this test, this is not something you take at lunch and then you go back to work. Take it when you have some time to process. And when we talked about those 7 steps, find people that are really wanting to dissect and enter this work as well. Share your results. Talk about what that looks like in process. Does that affirm who you bring into the ski resorts? Does it push up against who you've been missing? So it's opportunity to take that inside out approach and examine a snapshot around some of the biases, the implicit biases that we may hold.
So all you simply need to do is take out your smartphone, go to your scanner, and just scan it over this barcode here, and it'll take you to all the information and data that you need. And there'll be several tests there that you can pick and choose and start to look at multiple different areas related to your potential biases and work from there. On behalf of Tiffany and myself, I want to thank you for taking the time, the opportunity here this evening, or wherever you are, whatever time of day it is, to take part in this. Just remember, the work starts from within, and our ski industry needs you, each collective individual, to make a decision and make an effort to move forward with this opportunity to really grow diversity, inclusion, and equity. If we do so, we think our industry would be great and have opportunity for many more to really experience the wonders of the mountains of snow and being in that fresh air. Is such an amazing opportunity, and the more we can share that with others, particularly in our world today, we think we would be better off as an industry and better off as a country. Now, Tiffany, any closing words?
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to come before you, and nothing excites me more than people that are ready to lean into this work. Leaning in doesn't mean you have to have it all figured out, but just remember, this work around equity, diversity, inclusion, cultural competency, it is a journey, and I'm looking forward to see where you all go on your journey.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.